I used to love Easter. There was something about the pastel colors, the smell of spring after a long, bitter winter, and the comforting traditions that made everything feel warm and safe. That all changed 2 years ago, when I visited my grandparents' place in rural Pennsylvania for what I thought would be a quiet Easter weekend. I hadn't been out there in years, not since I was a kid, but after my grandfather's health took a turn, my family encouraged me to spend some time with them. They lived way out near the mountains, surrounded by thick woods that had always made me a little uneasy, even as a child, though I could never quite explain why. I arrived the Friday before Easter and immediately felt that strange disconnect you get when visiting people who live in a completely different rhythm than the rest of the world. No cell service, barely any internet, and an old television that barely functioned unless someone smacked the side of it a few times. Still, it was peaceful, and I welcomed the change of pace. The first night went by quietly. We had a simple dinner, talked about family memories, and I went to sleep in the upstairs guest room. It was in the middle of the night when I first heard the knocking. At first I thought it was a branch tapping against the window, until I remembered the window in the guest room was on the second floor, with nothing close enough outside to touch it. The knocking came again. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I got out of bed and peeked outside, but saw nothing in the moonlit yard. I chalked it up to old house sounds and went back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the unease crawling under my skin. The next morning I asked my grandmother if the house often creaked or made noises. She just gave me a strange look and said, "Sometimes the woods speak when they want to." That answer didn't sit well with me. As the day went on, I noticed little things that felt off. A missing shoe by the back door. The scarecrow in the garden had been knocked over, and its burlap head was missing. And there were muddy footprints, small, child-sized, leading from the woods to the back porch. I asked my grandfather if any kids lived nearby. He shook his head slowly and said, "Not in a long time. Not since the spring of '88. When I pressed him for more, he clammed up and changed the subject. That night the knocking returned. This time it came from the front door, then the side door, then both windows flanking the guest room, always in threes. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun rose, I went outside to look for footprints. Sure enough, there were dozens of them in the dew-covered grass, tiny, bare feet circling the house. My grandparents didn't seem surprised. In fact, they looked scared. My grandfather sat me down and told me something I'll never forget. Back in 1988, on Easter Sunday, a local church had hosted a big egg hunt in those woods. Families from all around came to participate, but during the event, 3 children went missing. They were never found. The story was buried, literally and figuratively, when the church burned down the following year under mysterious circumstances. Ever since then, strange things had happened around Easter. Knocking sounds, childlike footprints, and sightings of pale faces peering from the woods at night. My grandparents believed the children were still out there, not alive, not exactly dead either, trapped in some twisted loop tied to that day. I didn't know what to say. It sounded insane, but I'd heard the knocking. I'd seen the footprints. That night, I decided I wasn't going to cower in fear. I stayed up, sitting near the front door with the porch light on and my phone camera ready. Right at 3:03 a.m. I heard it again. 3 knocks. I swung the door open, phone in hand. There was no one there, but the footprints appeared right in front of me, pressing down into the damp earth one by one, as if made by invisible feet. Then I heard laughter, light, high-pitched, and close. I slammed the door shut and didn't move until sunrise. I told my grandparents I had to leave, but they begged me to stay through Easter Sunday. "If you leave now, it might follow you," my grandmother whispered. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Easter Sunday arrived with a stillness that felt unnatural. No birds chirped, no wind rustled the trees. It was like the world was holding its breath. My grandparents set the table for a modest dinner, but none of us could eat. Just as dusk fell, the air shifted. I can't describe it any better than that. It felt thick, electric, like the sky before a tornado. Then, all at once, the knocking came again, but not just at one door or window. It echoed all around the house. It sounded like 100 small fists pounding in perfect rhythm. We huddled in the living room, unsure what to do. Then the back door creaked open on its own. My grandfather, clutching a shotgun he hadn't touched in years, stepped forward. "They want something," he said. "Maybe closure, maybe blood." Before I could stop him, he walked out into the yard and disappeared into the woods. The knocking stopped instantly. We waited breathless for hours. He never came back. We called the police the next morning. They found no sign of him, just his footprints leading into the woods and a single Easter egg resting on a tree stump. Inside was his wedding ring. I left that afternoon and I haven't been back since. Every Easter I sleep with the lights on, and sometimes, just sometimes, I still hear the knocking. I thought I had left it all behind when I drove away from that house, from those woods, and from the haunting echo of that knocking that still played tricks on my ears, even in the silence of my apartment. But evil doesn't always stay buried, and sometimes it attaches itself to you in ways you don't realize until it's far too late. The first week back in the city felt normal enough. I distracted myself with work, friends, anything that would keep my mind from wandering to the image of my grandfather's footprints disappearing into the trees, or the way the door had opened on its own, as if inviting something in. But on the seventh night, I woke up at 3:03 a.m. to the sound of something knocking, not on my door, but from inside the walls. I told myself it was the pipes. That explanation lasted until the following night, when I heard it again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks, followed by the softest, most chilling giggle I've ever heard, one that didn't come from any neighbor's apartment. I barely slept after that. I started noticing things that I didn't want to admit to anyone, because I feared how it would sound. My reflection would linger in the mirror a split second too long after I turned away. My lights would flicker whenever I looked at photos from that Easter weekend. One morning I found muddy footprints, not just outside my door but leading into the apartment. They were small, child-sized, the same as the ones I saw in my grandparents' yard. I tried to ignore it, but the knocking kept happening every night at exactly 3:03 a.m. Always 3 knocks. Sometimes on the walls, sometimes at the door, sometimes on the ceiling. One night I found a single Easter egg placed on my kitchen table. I hadn't bought any. I hadn't let anyone in. I opened it slowly, half expecting it to be empty. Inside was a yellowed piece of paper with a drawing. 3 stick figures, each holding hands, standing under a twisted tree with dark red scribbles where the sun should have been. I burned the paper and threw the egg away, but the next morning another appeared, this time on my pillow. That was the breaking point. I called my grandmother. Her voice was thin and frightened when she answered. "It followed you, didn't it?" she asked before I could even speak. She told me she hadn't heard from my grandfather since that night. She'd reported him missing, but no search team found anything, not even the shotgun he'd taken with him. What they had found, however, was something far more disturbing. A clearing deep in the woods that no one remembered being there before. In that clearing were dozens of child-sized graves, unmarked and arranged in a perfect circle around a massive, gnarled tree. Beneath the tree was a plaque made of stone with the date April 3rd, 1988, and 3 names etched into it. None of them were my grandfather's. My grandmother swore that tree had never existed before, and the authorities dismissed it as some elaborate hoax, a sick joke. But she believed otherwise. They don't want to be forgotten, she told me. They want someone to play with. I started researching old newspapers, archives, anything that could help me make sense of what was happening. The church fire that supposedly destroyed the building after the children went missing had been ruled accidental. But I found something the public wasn't meant to see. A police report buried in a scanned file that described burn marks in the shape of small hands on the altar. The priest had gone missing weeks before the fire. One article described how he'd insisted that something evil had taken root in those woods, how the children were whispering to something beneath the soil. He claimed Easter was the day. They bloomed. That phrase haunted me, bloomed, as if they were seeds, as if something had planted them. The more I dug, the worse things got. My sleep turned to fevered nightmares where I stood in endless woods surrounded by invisible children who giggled, whispered, and pulled at my limbs until I woke drenched in sweat. I once woke up to find an egg in my mouth, still sealed. I vomited for hours. I stopped leaving my apartment, stopped answering my phone, stopped trusting my own eyes. One night I heard scratching behind the walls, followed by the slow creak of the hallway door opening. When I rushed to it, there was nothing there, except for a trail of jelly beans. They were old, cracked, covered in dust, and yet they smelled sweet, almost nauseatingly so. I followed them against every instinct screaming in my body. They led me to the building's basement, a place I'd never visited. The jelly beans stopped in front of the old laundry room door, which stood open just a crack. I pushed it open and found dozens of eggs, real, plastic, dyed, scattered across the floor. And in the middle, sitting cross-legged, was a small figure. Pale skin, hollow eyes, no face, just skin where the features should be. It tilted its head toward me and raised one hand. Knock, knock, knock. I ran. I don't remember getting back to my apartment. I just remember locking the door, breaking my lease the next day, and driving to a motel 3 towns over, where I've been holed up ever since. I haven't heard the knocking in 3 days. I haven't found any eggs. But every night I set an alarm for 3:02 a.m. and sit in silence, holding my breath, waiting, because something tells me it's not over. Not even close. I think they're waiting until Easter comes again, until the bloom happens once more, until someone else goes looking for answers and ends up playing a game they can't win. So if you hear knocking late at night, especially around Easter, don't answer it. And whatever you do, don't follow the trail of candy. That's how they find you. That's how they get in. I've never been someone who believes in omens or signs, but there was something undeniably unsettling about the way the fog clung to the road. The day Marie and I drove into Ashbrook Hollow, like it had been waiting for us, and not in a welcoming sort of way, more like it was trying to hide something old and patient and best left forgotten. We'd been married just under a year when she got word from her lawyer that her great-aunt Lillian had passed and left her a property in this secluded Appalachian town that didn't even show up on most GPS systems, a place Marie said she vaguely remembered visiting as a child, though her memories were fuzzy and always seemed to trail off whenever she tried to describe them, like her mind hit a wall the second she tried to recall anything beyond the front porch and the scent of lilies. The drive there was long, winding through unmarked mountain roads that snaked between dense forests and cliffs with no guardrails, and by the time we passed the weather-beaten sign that simply read, Ashbrook Hollow, Eastern 1842, something inside me tightened, not fear exactly, more like a subtle compression in my chest, like the town was exhaling around us, or maybe sighing at our arrival. The town itself was unnaturally quiet, not just peaceful but subdued, like someone had hit a universal mute button. No birdsong, no barking dogs, just the crunch of our tires over gravel as we rolled into what could barely be called a main street, lined with aging storefronts with boarded windows and hand-painted signs faded from decades of weather, and townsfolk who stopped to watch us with a particular kind of stillness that made the hairs on my neck stand at attention. Not angry, not welcoming, just still, like they were actors frozen in place, unsure if the director had called cut or action. The house was tucked at the far end of a dirt path choked with overgrowth and shaded by twisted trees that leaned toward the road like eavesdropping giants, their limbs too long and too low, casting shadows that shifted with the wind in ways that felt choreographed, almost sentient. When we pulled up to the house, an enormous 3-story colonial with peeling paint and a porch swing that creaked in the breeze like it was groaning under the weight of ghosts, Marie's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. She said it felt like coming home, though her voice trembled just slightly, like she wasn't entirely sure that was a good thing. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and something else, something older, like dust soaked in rainwater and time, and the walls were lined with old portraits of people who shared Marie's eyes, but nothing else, grim-faced ancestors who seemed to follow us from room to room with expressions that flickered slightly depending on the light, and sometimes I'd catch one seeming to smirk or frown when I wasn't looking directly at it. The townsfolk offered no welcome, no casserole or polite introductions, just occasional glances from porches and shop windows, and when I tried to make small talk at the general store, the old man behind the counter just blinked slowly and said, "Y'all come for the Easter crossing then?" in a tone that made it clear it wasn't really a question. And when I asked what that meant, he just smiled without his eyes and rang up our canned goods without another word. And it wasn't until I brought it up to Marie that I learned her family had deep ties to the town, that her great-aunt had once been what they called the Warden of the Hollow, a kind of ceremonial title passed down to women in her bloodline. Always female, always tied to the house, and something called the Hollow Cross, which Marie remembered in bits and pieces as a strange Easter tradition involving moonlit walks, whispered prayers, and baskets left at doorsteps that weren't for children but for something else. She seemed both frightened and fascinated by it, drawn to the mystery like a moth to a dying flame. And that night, as we lay in the creaky old bed beneath a ceiling fan that turned too slowly to be useful, she whispered that she'd dreamed of the Hollow Cross as a child, a tall wooden effigy nailed with eggshells and chicken bones and crowned with lilies, standing at the edge of the woods behind the church, where the trees grew too close together and the light never seemed to reach. I brushed it off as a mix of childhood imagination and the eerie influence of the place, but when we woke the next morning to find a basket sitting at our front door, lined with straw, filled with black eggs, and a note written in elegant cursive that read simply, "The Warden returns," I felt something cold pass through me, and the air inside the house seemed to warp slightly, like heat rising off asphalt, though the floorboards beneath us had gone icy to the touch. Marie was pale, her hands shaking as she held the basket, and though she tried to laugh it off, I could tell something had shifted in her, like a door in her mind had creaked open, just enough to let in something she hadn't realized she'd locked out. Over the next few days, she grew increasingly distracted, wandering the house at night, staring at old photographs and muttering phrases in a language I didn't recognize under her breath, and I caught her one evening standing barefoot in the air. Backyard near the woods, arms raised as if in prayer, whispering to the trees while a circle of crows sat silently in the branches above her, not cawing, not moving, just watching like they were waiting for something. Easter was approaching, and the town began to change in quiet, eerie ways. White cloths appeared on every door, lanterns were lit with crimson candles that never seemed to burn down, and the church bell began to toll each evening at exactly 3:33 a.m., even though no one ever seemed to enter or exit the building. I confronted one of the neighbors, a gaunt woman with eyes too large for her face who lived 2 houses down, and asked her what was happening. She didn't answer at first, just stared at me with something between pity and amusement, then said, "You'll see soon enough once the moon splits the sky," and turned to go inside without another word. That night, I dreamed of the woods behind the church, of a procession of figures in white robes walking silently toward a massive cross carved into the ground itself, bleeding light from deep within the earth, and at the center of the cross stood Marie, smiling serenely, holding a basket filled with writhing things I couldn't identify, and when I woke up drenched in sweat, I found her standing at the window, humming a song I'd never heard, a lullaby that made the shadows in the room seem to pulse in rhythm. I begged her to leave with me, to go back to the city, to forget the inheritance and the house in this cursed little valley, but she shook her head and said, "I can't go. Not before the crossing." And her voice sounded like it was echoing, like it wasn't entirely hers anymore. I should have forced her to leave then, should have dragged her to the car and driven until we saw streetlights again, but I didn't. I stayed, out of love or fear, or some deeper thread I couldn't name, and now I think it's already too late, because the baskets have started appearing on every doorstep. The crows are gathering in flocks large enough to blot out the sun, and I found a white robe hanging in our closet this morning with Marie's name stitched into the collar and mine stitched into the hem beneath it. And as I write this, I hear the church bell tolling again, even though it's only just after midnight, and Marie is no longer in bed beside me. I didn't sleep after hearing that bell toll at midnight. Not really. Not even after it stopped echoing through the hills like a signal to something deep beneath the surface, something that didn't live by our clocks or calendars, but by its own rules, ancient and wet and buried in roots older than any house in Ashbrook Hollow. And when I got out of bed, the robe was still there in the closet, smooth and unwrinkled despite the fact that neither of us had hung it, the stitching too perfect, too clean, like the thread itself hadn't come from any modern spool but something older, hand-woven maybe, or worse, made by something else entirely. And Marie was already gone from the house. No footsteps, no note, no car missing. Just the cold breeze of a front door that had been opened and left ajar, like someone had slipped out silently and deliberately. And I followed her trail instinctively, past the broken fence, through the tall grass that seemed to part for me like it was guiding me rather than resisting me, toward the distant glow coming from behind the church, the old, moss-covered chapel that no one ever seemed to enter, where the doors always stayed closed, and the windows always looked black from the outside no matter the time of day. And as I got closer, I saw that I wasn't the only one walking the path that night. Figures in white robes, dozens of them, were moving in eerie unison toward the woods beyond the chapel, each carrying a small wicker basket, their faces hidden under deep hoods and their feet bare despite the frost glistening on the grass, and not a single one of them made a sound, not even when I accidentally stepped on a stick and it snapped underfoot like a gunshot. No turning heads, no gasps, just that slow, uninterrupted march, as if they were caught in some trance or ancient choreography passed down over generations. And I stood there at the edge of the trees, heart pounding in my throat, when a child's voice whispered, right next to my ear, "You're not supposed to watch." And I spun around, but no one was there, only the hanging fog and the distant whisper of wind moving through branches that looked too much like limbs to ignore. Still, I followed, because I had to. Because Marie was in that procession somewhere, and I wasn't going to let whatever madness had swallowed this place take her too. And the woods grew darker the deeper I went, not because of the trees exactly, but because of the way the shadows moved between them, flowing like liquid, bending the light from the torches the robed figures held aloft until it seemed like we were walking through a dream or a nightmare with no end. And then we reached the clearing, a perfectly circular space where nothing grew, not a blade of grass or weed, just earth that looked scorched and cracked like it had been struck by lightning centuries ago, and at the center stood the hollow, cross just as Marie had described it, a wooden effigy twice the height of any man, its limbs outstretched and nailed at the ends with iron spikes, its head crowned with dead lilies that hadn't withered but dried in perfect formation, like they were waiting for their next bloom. And beneath it was an altar of black stone where the baskets were being placed, one by one, in solemn reverence. And when Marie stepped forward from the group, robe open just enough to reveal her face, she was smiling, not wildly, not insanely, but peacefully, like someone who had just come home after a long, exhausting journey, and she looked directly at me, right through me, and nodded once, a small gesture that shattered me completely, because in that moment I understood. She wasn't Marie anymore. Not fully, not entirely. Something else had taken hold or awoken inside her, something older than her memories and deeper than her love for me. And I screamed her name. I ran into the circle, grabbed her by the shoulders, tried to shake her back to reality. But the moment my foot crossed that circle's edge, everything changed. The sky turned blood red above us. The moon split into 3 jagged shards that bled silver light. And a sound filled the air like 100 voices singing in reverse. And all the robed figures turned to me at once, their hoods falling back to reveal faces not of men or women, but of something else. Eyes too many, mouths stitched shut, skin carved with runes that shimmered in the cursed moonlight. And still none of them touched me, not even when I dropped to my knees and begged Marie to leave with me, her face softening slightly, tears slipping down her cheeks, as if some part of her was still fighting, still there, and she whispered, "I'm sorry," just once, before placing her basket on the altar and stepping back into the circle, joining hands with the others as they began to chant in a language that made my stomach churn and my ears ring, and the hollow cross began to glow, not with fire, but with a pale green light that pulsed like a heartbeat, and then it rose, lifted not by machinery or human effort, but by something unseen, and the air grew thick, heavy, electric, and the earth beneath us groaned like it was waking up, and something stepped out from beneath the altar. Or maybe it had always been there, waiting, dreaming, watching, a figure too large to fully see, more shadow than substance, with eyes like burning coal and hands that crackled with vines and bones, and feathers. And it reached toward the altar, toward the offerings, toward Marie. And I screamed her name again, louder this time, and something in her snapped, her eyes clearing for a second, her body stumbling backward, and whatever spell had gripped the gathering shattered just enough for chaos to erupt. The robed figures shrieked, the sky cracked, the earth trembled, and Marie ran, grabbing my hand, pulling me through the woods as that thing roared behind us, its voice like 1,000 storms, its breath hot against our backs as branches whipped. At our faces and roots tried to trip us, but we didn't stop. Not until we burst through the tree line and collapsed onto the dirt road behind the house, coughing, bleeding, shaking, and the sun was rising, finally rising, as if the night itself had been holding it back. And when we looked back, the woods were gone. Not just the clearing or the church, but everything. Where the forest had been was now an open field, empty, flat, and quiet. And Marie sobbed into my chest, muttering apologies between gasps, saying she didn't remember most of it. Only fragments. Only pieces of a ritual passed down through blood and time and darkness, and that she had almost given in completely. But something about seeing me, hearing me, had pulled her back. And we left that day. Didn't pack. Didn't even go back. Inside the house, just drove until the mountains disappeared behind us, and every attempt to find Ashbrook Hollow again has failed. Roads that led there before are now dead ends or gated trails, and no one has ever heard of it, not even her lawyer, who swore he never sent a letter or handled any will regarding a great-aunt named Lillian. And when we returned to the general area weeks later with state maps and GPS, all we found was an abandoned stretch of land with no sign of a town, no sign of a house, just a single weathered wooden sign half buried in the dirt that read, "The Hollow Remembers." And Marie won't speak of it anymore, won't look at pictures from that. Time won't even celebrate Easter, and every year as the season approaches she becomes withdrawn, quieter, and on the night before Easter Sunday, she locks every door and window in our house, places a circle of salt around our bed, and clutches an old cross she found in her jacket pocket the morning we fled, a cross made of bone and dried lilies bound together with hair. And I never ask where it came from, because I know the answer, and because I can still hear the church bell in my dreams, tolling at exactly 3:33, and I know that somewhere out there, Ashbrook Hollow is waiting, hidden behind the veil, waiting for its warden to return. Story It was supposed to be a small-town Easter tradition, nothing more than a colorful little egg hunt at the local park with homemade lemonade, plastic eggs filled with stale candy, and smiling parents taking pictures of their kids dressed in pastels and bunny ears. But the year my younger brother Elijah went missing, everything about that sunny Sunday morning became a wound I could never close, a rot that lingered under my skin even decades later, because something ancient, something hungry, was hiding. In that field, watching the children, waiting for someone just curious enough, just alone enough to be pulled in. And even now I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I still hear his voice calling for me from beneath the earth, faint and cracked and echoing like it's bouncing off dirt-packed walls. And it all began with an egg, a gold egg, glinting at the edge of the tree line just beyond the orange rope that marked the safe zone of the hunt. And though my mother always warned us never to step past that barrier, Elijah was only 6, too young to resist something shiny and rare, and tucked just far enough away to feel special. And I didn't see him go, didn't notice until the final whistle blew, and all the other kids were returning with their baskets full and faces flushed. From running through grass and sunshine, and my own heart stuttered when I looked around and realized Elijah wasn't beside me, wasn't anywhere I could see. And then I heard my mom shout his name with that sharp, panicked edge that instantly turned a festive morning into a nightmare. And we searched. All of us, every parent and police officer and volunteer in that town, combed the woods for hours, calling his name, retracing his steps, digging through bramble and lifting rocks. But he was gone. Completely gone. Not a single footprint. Not a broken branch or scrap of clothing. Just his empty basket dropped in the grass near that golden egg, which, when picked up, turned out to be made of something strange. Not plastic, not metal, but some heavy bone-colored material that felt warm to the touch and had carvings etched into its surface like symbols from a language no one could read. And that's when the police got weird about it. When they started asking questions that didn't feel normal, like whether anyone in our family had ever experienced hallucinations or heard voices. Whether Elijah had talked about dreams or strange drawings, And then they took the egg away and told my mother not to worry, that sometimes children just wander off, and that he'd probably come back on his own, which was bullshit. Then, and it's still bullshit now, because no child just vanishes without a sound, especially not in broad daylight in front of dozens of adults. And the only one who really seemed to believe me when I said something was wrong was my grandfather, an old man who barely left his recliner and mostly communicated in grunts and Bible verses, but who pulled me aside the day after and whispered, "The old soil's opening again," before shoving a cracked leather notebook into my hands and warning me never to tell my mum what I saw or what I'd read. And I still remember that notebook, stuffed with yellowed pages, drawings of hollow trees with eyes, notes about the hunger beneath and the marked ones, and a recurring phrase that sent chills through me even though I didn't understand it at the time. Eggs are not gifts, they are invitations. And I carried that notebook with me everywhere for years, even after the case went cold, even after my mother stopped setting a place for Elijah at the dinner table and started pretending he'd never existed, even after they filled in the playground where he vanished and built a strip mall on the land, like paving over it would erase the memory. But it didn't. Not for me, not for the others either. The ones who'd lost siblings or cousins or best friends at that park over the years, each one disappearing during some Easter event or spring picnic, always near the woods, always with no explanation. And though the town buried those stories, quietly paid off families, blamed runaways and poor parenting, I started collecting them, every account, every article, every whisper from the old-timers who'd long stopped trusting. The police, and they all said the same thing. There was something under that town, something that fed on celebration, that lured the innocent with promises of treasure. And once every few years it demanded a sacrifice, and no one wanted to believe me. Not until last Easter, when I saw the gold egg again. This time placed delicately on the windowsill of my apartment 6 towns over, far from the park, far from home, gleaming under the moonlight like it had followed me all this time. And when I opened it, there wasn't candy or a toy or anything like that, just a scrap of cloth. Elijah's, unmistakably his, a piece of his old superhero pajamas with his name stitched into the seam, and beneath that was a small, curled-up note written in his handwriting, shaky and childlike, that read, "Still here. Don't forget me." And something in me broke, all the years of grief and doubt and fear collapsing at once, because it meant he wasn't dead. Not fully, not yet. And I had to go back, had to return to the place everyone else had forgotten, dig beneath the surface of that cursed land and find out what was really there, and maybe bring him back, if I was fast enough, brave enough, or stupid enough to try. I don't know what I was expecting when I stood there, holding Elijah's torn piece of clothing, staring down at the gold egg. Maybe I was hoping for some sign that all of this had been a horrible misunderstanding. Maybe I thought that, by some miracle, I'd open it and find a phone number, a clue, something that would lead me to him. But there was nothing, except that cryptic note scrawled in his childish handwriting, "Still here, don't forget me." The pain, the unanswered questions, the years of grief all rushed back, flooding over me like a wave I couldn't escape. I spent the rest of that night staring at the egg in my hands, my mind unraveling with fear and confusion. The note felt like a desperate plea, a message from somewhere beyond, from a place that had swallowed my brother and countless others over the years. I knew deep down that the answers wouldn't come from anyone else. No one was going to help me. The town had long since moved on. The case was closed, swept under the rug, and it had been years since anyone even dared to speak Elijah's name out loud. But I couldn't let it go. Not when there was this dark promise of something that had been hidden away under that town for centuries, something I needed to find, something that might still have my brother. I immediately packed my things, everything I thought I might need for a journey into the unknown. There was no plan, no blueprint, no logical steps to follow. I had no idea how I was going to do this or what I was going to find, but one thing was certain. I had to go back to the park, back to the woods where my brother had vanished all those years ago, the place that held so many secrets, so many lost lives buried beneath its branches. I left that night without a word to anyone, heading back toward the town I'd long since abandoned. As the hours passed and I neared the outskirts of that cursed place, A creeping sense of dread began to fill my chest. The streets looked different now, empty, desolate, as if the years had taken their toll, leaving nothing but memories behind. The park, too, looked abandoned, the swing set creaking in the wind like a ghost. I walked through the gates slowly, the feeling of unease growing with every step. The air felt thick, suffocating, and it smelled wrong, musty, as though the earth itself was trying to keep me away, warning me that some things were better left untouched. But I pressed on, ignoring the gut-wrenching feeling that urged me to turn around. I had come too far and I couldn't stop now, not when I was so close. The place where Elijah had disappeared was just beyond the main clearing near the tree line. The spot was overgrown now, with tall weeds and ivy crawling up the old trees, but the ground was still the same, still undisturbed, as if it had never been searched, never been touched. I crouched down, my hands trembling as I began to dig. The earth was soft, pliable, and seemed to give way far too easily. For a moment, I wondered if I was simply digging into a place that had been disturbed long ago, a place that had swallowed so many memories and whispers. But then my shovel hit something hard, something unnatural. My heart leapt into my throat, and I dropped the shovel, my hands now scraping desperately at the earth with my bare hands. I could feel it beneath my fingers, the cold surface of something old, something that had been buried for a long time. I tore the earth away until, finally, I could see it clearly. A large, dark shape, something covered in moss and dirt as though it had been there for centuries. I reached down and pulled it out, gasping in disbelief when I saw what it was. It was a box, an old wooden chest with iron hinges that had long since rusted. I almost couldn't believe my eyes. What could this be? What was so important that it had been hidden away for all this time? I ran my hands over the surface of the chest, feeling the rough texture, the indentations, the carvings etched deep into the wood. It was an ancient design, one that felt familiar yet foreign at the same time. I fumbled with the latch, my fingers slipping, until I managed to open it. The moment the lid creaked open, a rush of cold air seemed to pour out, carrying with it the smell of rot and decay. Inside the chest were old crumbling papers, yellowed with age, as well as a strange, intricately carved object wrapped in cloth. I picked it up carefully, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a figurine, something made of bone or ivory, shaped like an ancient deity or creature, its features warped and unsettling, as though it had been designed with some unearthly purpose in mind. I turned the figure over in my hands, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. But it wasn't the figure that caught my attention. It was the thing beneath it. Another egg like the one I'd seen years ago. Only this one was different. It wasn't gold, but dark and smooth, almost like obsidian. And as I held it in my hands, I felt a sudden oppressive weight pressing down on me, as though the earth itself was holding me there, unwilling to let go. I heard something then. Something faint but distinct. A sound in the distance like the crunch of leaves underfoot, and then the whisper of a voice just on the edge of hearing, calling my name. "Elijah," I whispered, the name escaping my lips before I could stop myself. And then, without warning, the ground shifted beneath me, and I stumbled, losing my balance as the earth opened up before me. A sinkhole, a massive hole had formed, right in front of me. And before I could react, I was falling, tumbling downward, down into the darkness below. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the air, by the earth itself, and the last thing I saw before the world went black was the gold egg rolling away from me, disappearing into the void. And then everything went silent.